Racist cop targets black woman. Unaware her encrypted warrant exposes a secret ring shielding his crimes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Naomi Carter moved through the civic building with a steady pace that drew little attention, the kind of calm that blended into marble hallways and muted fluorescent light. She was a black woman in her early 30s, professionally dressed, carrying a slim leather folder that appeared ordinary to anyone who passed her. The morning air outside had been cool, hovering in the low 60s, and the building's climate-controlled stillness felt deliberately detached from the city beyond its doors. To Naomi, this place represented order on the surface and habits beneath it, routines so familiar that few people questioned who benefited from them. Across the lobby, Officer Daniel Crow leaned against a column near the security checkpoint, watching the flow of people with practiced confidence. He was white, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform like a permanent badge of entitlement, the kind earned not only through years of service, but through knowing exactly which lines could be crossed without consequence. Crow had built a reputation for efficiency, for keeping things clean, and for understanding how to apply pressure without leaving marks that could be easily challenged. When Naomi approached the checkpoint, Crow's attention sharpened, not because she looked suspicious, but because she didn't fit the unspoken hierarchy he expected to control. He stepped forward, voice measured and official, requesting identification with a tone that suggested compliance was not optional. Naomi complied without hesitation, offering her documents calmly, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. There was no argument in her movements, no visible frustration, only a quiet patience that unsettled Crow more than open resistance ever could. He scanned her information longer than necessary, asking procedural questions that carried an edge of assumption, while nearby staff continued their routines as if nothing unusual was happening. To them, this was just another checkpoint, another interaction that would be forgotten before lunchtime. What Crow could not see, and did not suspect, was that Naomi's folder contained a digital key embedded within an encrypted warrant, authorized through channels far beyond the local level, designed to activate only under specific conditions. It was not a warrant meant to announce itself loudly or dramatically. It was a silent instrument created to observe, to confirm patterns, and to expose relationships that thrived in the shadows of routine authority. Naomi had not come to confront anyone directly, and she had not come to demand recognition. Her role required the opposite, a willingness to be underestimated, to let familiar assumptions play out exactly as they always did. As Crow continued his inspection, his questions grew sharper, his skepticism more pronounced, each word revealing his comfort with control and his confidence that the system around him would support whatever conclusion he chose to reach. Naomi answered simply, never volunteering more than was asked, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough to reveal its shape. In that space between question and response, the first invisible threads tightened, not around her, but around the network that believed itself untouchable. Crow finally handed back her documents with a dismissive glance, unaware that his actions had already triggered a sequence he could neither see nor stop. And as Naomi walked past him into the heart of the building, she carried not anger or fear, but certainty, the kind built on preparation, patience, and the quiet knowledge that systems often collapse not from force, but from being allowed to reveal themselves. Inside the building, the rhythm of the day continued with practiced indifference, elevators chiming softly, shoes echoing across polished floors, voices lowered to a professional murmur that suggested importance without urgency. Naomi Carter moved deeper into the structure, passing offices marked with brass lettering and sealed doors that rarely opened for anyone outside a narrow circle. She noted the details without reacting to them. The security cameras angled slightly downward, the way staff members glanced up and then away, their attention trained to recognize rank more than presence. To most of them, she was simply another visitor navigating a government space, someone to be processed and forgotten. What none of them understood was that her calm had been tested long before this morning, rehearsed through years of learning how systems respond when they believe they are in control. Behind her, Officer Daniel Crow returned to his position near the checkpoint, his interest already fading. Encounters like that were routine to him, moments of asserting authority that blended together until they felt indistinguishable. He adjusted his belt, exchanged a knowing look with a colleague, and resumed scanning the lobby with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully challenged. Crow trusted the structure around him, the supervisors who relied on his reports, the internal processes that always seemed to validate his decisions. Experience had taught him that questions rarely traveled upward, and when they did, they lost their sharpness along the way. Meanwhile, Naomi entered a waiting area outside a restricted office, taking a seat beneath a framed mission statement that spoke of transparency and accountability in carefully chosen words. She placed her folder on her lap, hands resting lightly on top, her breathing steady. The warrant inside remained dormant, its encryption untouched, its purpose patient. It did not react to noise or confrontation. It responded to access, to timestamps, to the invisible permissions that activated only when the correct sequence of events unfolded. Minutes passed. A digital clock on the wall ticked forward, each second unremarkable on its own, yet collectively forming the window she needed. Somewhere above her, within secured servers and archived records, data shifted almost imperceptibly, aligning with identifiers linked to her presence in the building. Naomi did not look at her phone. She did not fidget. Her role required stillness, the discipline to let the environment behave exactly as it always did. In another corridor, Crow laughed quietly with a fellow officer, recounting a minor incident from earlier in the week, his tone casual, his confidence unshaken. He had no reason to suspect that anything had changed. The routines that protected him were still intact, or so he believed. He had spent years understanding which complaints stalled, which paperwork disappeared, and which alliances ensured that scrutiny never lingered too long. What he could not see was that the warrant was not designed to accuse him directly. It was built to observe the pathways that shielded him, the approvals granted without review, the patterns of intervention that quietly erased accountability. Naomi's presence in the building acted as a key, confirming access points and validating records that had never been examined together before. The system did not announce this shift. It did not alert the lobby or interrupt Crow's conversation. It simply began to remember everything it had been trained to overlook. As Naomi sat there, she reflected briefly on how often power mistook silence for weakness, how frequently patience was interpreted as compliance. She knew that before the day was over, those assumptions would begin to unravel, not through confrontation, but through exposure. When her name was finally called, she stood smoothly, collected her folder, and followed the assistant down the hallway, leaving behind a waiting area that looked exactly the same as it had when she arrived. The difference was invisible, embedded in data and timing, and already moving beyond the reach of anyone who believed they were protected by habit alone. The corridor Naomi Carter followed narrowed as it moved away from public offices, the lighting softening, the sound of footsteps muted by carpet that suggested discretion rather than comfort. The assistant guiding her spoke little, offering only brief directions, as if conversation itself was discouraged in this part of the building. Naomi listened without reacting, her attention focused on the subtle signals around her, access panels set into the walls, doors that required layered authentication, and the quiet hum of infrastructure designed to operate unseen. When they reached a conference room, she was invited to sit at a long table beneath a row of recessed lights, the space arranged to feel neutral, controlled, and deliberately unremarkable. As the door closed behind her, the assistant stepped away, leaving Naomi alone with the steady ticking of a wall clock and the low vibration of the building itself. She placed her folder on the table and waited, not out of uncertainty, but because waiting was part of the sequence. The warrant within her folder had already begun its work, cross-referencing entries, confirming authorizations, and mapping relationships that were never meant to be seen together. It did not rush. It mirrored the patience of those who believed time was on their side. Elsewhere in the building, Officer Daniel Crow continued to shift, unaware that his name had surfaced within systems he had never needed to think about. He moved through familiar spaces, greeting supervisors, exchanging brief updates, reinforcing the image of reliability that had protected him for years. Crow believed in patterns, in the idea that tomorrow would look like yesterday, because it always had. He trusted that his record, carefully shaped and quietly defended, would remain intact. What he did not understand was that patterns only remain invisible until someone chooses to trace them. Back in the conference room, Naomi adjusted her posture slightly as a notification vibrated silently within the encrypted device embedded in her folder, a signal that initial validation had completed. She did not open it. She did not need to. Her role was not to analyze data in real time, but to be present, to ensure the warrant moved through authorized channels without interference. The true weight of what was unfolding lay beyond the room, spreading through internal systems that rarely faced scrutiny. Approval chains that had once felt routine now appeared as anomalies. Intervention records that had been dismissed individually began to form a coherent picture when viewed together. The system, for the first time in years, was being asked to explain itself. A few floors below, Crow felt a faint shift he could not name, a subtle tension in conversations, a hesitation where there had once been easy confidence. A supervisor paused longer than usual while reviewing a screen. A routine request took minutes instead of seconds. Crow dismissed it as administrative delay, the kind that always resolved itself. He had learned not to worry about questions unless they were spoken aloud. Naomi remained still as the clock continued its steady march, her expression composed, her breathing even. She thought briefly about how often people mistook visibility for importance, how loudly some demanded attention, while the most consequential actions unfolded quietly. The warrant was designed for moments like this, to allow systems to expose their own contradictions without spectacle. When the door finally opened and a senior administrator entered the room, the change in atmosphere was immediate, though understated. The administrator's tone was polite, careful, and notably precise, as if every word carried weight. Naomi responded in kind, answering questions directly, providing confirmations without elaboration. The conversation remained professional, almost restrained, yet beneath it ran an unspoken acknowledgement that something irreversible had begun. As the meeting concluded and Naomi gathered her folder, she understood that the day was no longer about her presence. The process she had initiated would continue without her, moving through layers of oversight that could no longer ignore what they revealed. When she exited the room and stepped back into the corridor, the building looked the same as it had hours earlier, but the certainty that had once shielded certain individuals was already eroding, replaced by the quiet pressure of accountability finding its way through a system that had long resisted it. As Naomi Carter exited the secured corridor, the atmosphere of the building subtly shifted, though no announcement marked the change. Phones rang with slightly more urgency. Footsteps paused longer outside closed doors, and conversations lowered to tones that suggested uncertainty rather than routine. Naomi moved through it all without acknowledgement, her pace unchanged, her focus forward. Her role had never required her to be seen reacting to the consequences she set in motion. Instead, she observed how spaces responded when their sense of control began to thin. Across the building, Officer Daniel Crow felt the difference more directly, though he struggled to define it. A request he submitted for routine clearance remained pending longer than expected. A supervisor who normally offered quick approval responded with a brief message asking for additional documentation. None of it was alarming on its own, but together it created friction in processes that had always moved smoothly for him. Crow dismissed the delays as administrative inefficiency, a problem of systems rather than scrutiny. He had learned long ago that authority did not need explanation when it was familiar. Yet familiarity was beginning to fail him. As the afternoon progressed, Crow noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with him. Conversations ended sooner. Eye contact lingered in ways that felt evaluative rather than respectful. A passing remark about compliance training carried an undertone that made him pause. He responded with the same practiced confidence he always used, reinforcing his image as dependable, composed, and unaffected. What he could not see was the way his name now appeared in context that stripped away that image, linked not to isolated incidents, but to patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Meanwhile, Naomi reached a public exit and stepped outside, the air warmer now, climbing into the low 70s, sunlight reflecting off glass and steel. She paused briefly at the edge of the steps, not to look back, but to allow timing to complete its work. The warrant she carried did not depend on her proximity anymore. It had passed into systems designed to protect themselves, systems now confronted with evidence that required response rather than deflection. Naomi understood that the most effective accountability often unfolded without spectacle, through processes. That left no room for personal interpretation. She blended into the sidewalk traffic, another face among many, while behind her, internal notifications continued to propagate through departments accustomed to operating without interruption. Back inside, Crow was summoned for a routine check-in, framed as procedural, nothing out of the ordinary. He entered the office with ease, offering a casual greeting, expecting the usual brief exchange. The tone, however, was different, measured, deliberate, and notably neutral. Questions were specific, focused on timelines and approvals, framed carefully but persistent enough to unsettle him. Crow answered confidently, relying on the same explanations that had always sufficed. This time, the responses were noted without affirmation. No reassurance followed. When he left the office, Crow felt a tightness he had not experienced before, a sense that the rules he relied on were being rewritten without his input. Naomi, now several blocks away, boarded a train heading out of the district, her reflection briefly visible in the window as the doors closed. She did not check her messages. She did not need confirmation. Experience had taught her that when systems begin asking questions of themselves, momentum builds quietly and steadily. The exposure she initiated was not designed to resolve quickly or cleanly. It was designed to prevent retreat. As the train moved forward, Naomi considered how often people mistook authority for permanence, how rarely they noticed the fragility beneath procedures that depended on silence to survive. By the time Crow returned to his station, the building felt unfamiliar to him, as though he had stepped into a version of his workplace that no longer recognized his unspoken privileges. The certainty he once carried began to erode, replaced by an awareness he had never needed before, the realization that systems, once turned inward, could be far less forgiving than any individual accusation. By early evening, the consequences Naomi Carter had set in motion began to surface in ways that were subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone not paying close attention. Within administrative offices and compliance departments, routine audits quietly expanded their scope, pulling records that had not been reviewed in years. Files once considered resolved were reopened under neutral language, flagged not for wrongdoing, but for clarification. To the system, it was simply due diligence. To those who understood how rarely such diligence occurred, it signaled a shift that could not be undone. Officer Daniel Crow felt the pressure intensify as the hours passed. A notification appeared in his inbox requesting confirmation of case handling procedures from previous quarters, framed as a standard internal review. He had received similar requests before, but never with this level of specificity. Dates, authorizations, and secondary approvals were listed in detail, each one familiar enough to reassure him at first, yet numerous enough to create unease. Crow responded promptly, confident that the answers he provided would align with existing records. What he did not realize was that those records were now being viewed side by side for the first time. their inconsistencies no longer isolated. In offices removed from CHRO's daily environment, analysts compared timelines and noted patterns that did not align with official explanations. Certain interventions appeared repeatedly at critical moments, always resolving potential issues before they could escalate. Names surfaced alongside those interventions, forming clusters that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The system did not accuse. It observed. It documented. It prepared. Naomi, now home, placed her folder inside a locked drawer and moved on with her evening routine as if the day had been unremarkable. She prepared a simple meal, reviewed unrelated notes, and allowed the hours to pass without checking for updates. Experience had taught her that the most important developments often occurred without notification. The warrant was designed to operate independently, ensuring that no single individual could be pressured or influenced to stop its progression. It relied on procedure, not courage. Back at the precinct, CHRO noticed a shift in how his authority was received. A junior officer hesitated before following a directive. A supervisor requested written confirmation for a decision that previously required only a verbal exchange. These moments were small, easily rationalized, yet together they disrupted the sense of certainty CHRO had relied on for years. He reassured himself that scrutiny was temporary, a phase that would pass once the review concluded. The system had always corrected itself in his favor. What he did not consider was the possibility that the system was no longer correcting, but recalibrating. As nights settled in, encrypted data packets continued to move through secure channels, each one unlocking another layer of context. Financial approvals, internal communications, and procedural overrides aligned into a narrative that required no interpretation to understand. The shield that had once protected CHRO was revealed not as a single barrier, but as a network of quiet decisions made by many individuals, each believing their action insignificant on its own. Naomi reflected briefly on how often accountability failed not because of malice, but because of fragmentation, the way responsibility dissolved when divided too finely. The warrant addressed that weakness by reconnecting what had been deliberately separated. By the time CHRO ended his shift, he sensed that something fundamental had changed. The building felt less accommodating, the routines less forgiving. He left with the same outward composure he always displayed. Yet internally, he grappled with an unfamiliar awareness that explanations might soon be demanded in ways he could not redirect. Naomi, preparing for rest, understood that the most difficult part of such operations was patience, allowing systems to reach their own conclusions without interference. She knew that exposure rarely arrived with drama. It arrived with documentation, with confirmations that removed the comfort of denial. As the night progressed, the groundwork was laid for questions that could no longer be postponed, and for answers that would no longer be accepted at face value. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that blended into routine schedules and predictable traffic patterns. Yet within internal systems, the previous day's activity continued to expand. Naomi Carter woke early, not from urgency, but habit, aware that the phase unfolding no longer required her presence. The warrant had moved fully into its analytical stage, drawing lines between approvals, communications, and procedural shortcuts that had long avoided intersection. What once appeared as isolated administrative choices now formed a structure with intent, a framework that suggested protection rather than oversight. Naomi understood that this was the moment many operations faltered, when impatience tempted intervention. She resisted it, trusting the design that allowed truth to surface without pressure. At the precinct, Officer Daniel CHRO sensed the change before he could name it. His morning briefing felt different, shorter, more reserved. Information that usually flowed freely was delivered with caution, stripped of commentary. When he logged into his workstation, access permissions he had relied on were temporarily restricted, accompanied by a neutral message citing ongoing review. The language was careful, almost courteous, yet unmistakably firm. CHRO attempted to laugh it off with colleagues, framing it as bureaucratic overreach. but the responses he received lacked the easy reassurance he expected. No one contradicted him. No one agreed either. As hours passed, Crow was asked to provide additional clarification on past cases, this time through formal channels rather than informal conversations. The requests referenced internal codes he had not seen before, oversight mechanisms designed for rare circumstances. He complied, drawing on memory and documentation, confident that his explanations aligned with protocol. What unsettled him was the absence of immediate feedback. His responses disappeared into systems that did not respond with validation or dismissal. Elsewhere, analysts continued to reconstruct timelines with growing precision. The encrypted warrant did not accuse individuals directly. Instead, it revealed dependencies, how certain names appeared whenever accountability threatened to surface, how interventions clustered around the same decision-makers. The pattern suggested a ring not defined by secrecy alone, but by familiarity, a shared understanding that certain outcomes were expected and quietly enforced. Naomi reviewed a brief update later that afternoon, noting that the analysis had reached confirmation thresholds. She closed the message without comment. For her, the significance lay not in revelation, but in inevitability. The structure had always existed. It simply required the right conditions to become visible. Back at the precinct, Crow was summoned again, this time to a meeting framed as collaborative. The room felt neutral, yet the questions were precise, referencing correlations rather than incidents. He realized then that the focus had shifted from what happened to how often it happened, from individual decisions to systemic response. His usual defenses felt insufficient, built for isolated scrutiny rather than cumulative examination. Crow left the meeting with a growing awareness that familiarity was no longer protecting him. The routines he once navigated effortlessly now required explanation, and explanations invited further inquiry. As the day wore on, internal notifications reached offices beyond the precinct, extending into departments that rarely interacted. The reach of the warrant became apparent in its breadth, not through announcements, but through the number of stakeholders quietly looped into the process. Naomi considered how often injustice persisted, not because of active malice, but because complexity discouraged accountability. The warrant addressed that by simplifying exposure, reducing elaborate defenses to observable facts. By evening, Crow sat alone at his desk longer than usual, reviewing past decisions with a perspective he had never needed before. Each file carried a weight it never had, each approval a question rather than a conclusion. He began to understand that the system he trusted was not turning against him arbitrarily. It was doing what it had always claimed to do, only. This time without looking away. Naomi, watching the city lights from her window, recognized this stage as the most revealing, when certainty eroded quietly, replaced by the realization that silence no longer guaranteed safety. The process continued, steady and impersonal, moving closer to a point where denial would no longer be possible. The shift from analysis to consequence did not arrive with alarms or public statements, but with a quiet synchronization across departments that had rarely aligned before. Naomi Carter sensed it through a brief secure update that confirmed what preparation had predicted. The encrypted warrant had completed its cross-validation phase and elevated its findings beyond discretionary review. The language was clinical, almost detached, yet the implication was unmistakable. The system had reached a point where it could no longer contain what it now understood. Naomi closed the message and went about her day, knowing that from this moment forward, events would unfold without her intervention. At the precinct, Officer Daniel Crow experienced the reveal not as a dramatic confrontation, but as an unraveling of certainty. He was notified that his active caseload would be temporarily reassigned pending administrative assessment, a measure described as routine and precautionary. The phrasing was polite, the tone neutral, but the effect was immediate. Colleagues who once deferred to him now avoided engagement, not out of hostility, but caution. Crow attempted to project confidence, reminding himself that reviews ended and routines resumed, yet the absence of reassurance gnawed at him. In parallel offices across the city, senior administrators reviewed consolidated reports that traced years of procedural anomalies into a coherent structure. The evidence did not accuse with emotion. It demonstrated with clarity. Authorization logs showed recurring interventions. Communication records revealed informal confirmations that bypassed oversight. Financial adjustments aligned with moments of potential exposure. Individually, each entry had been defensible. Together, they formed a map of protection. Naomi had always understood that truth rarely needed embellishment when presented in full context. The reveal came when that context could no longer be fragmented. Crow was summoned to a formal interview framed as informational, yet the questions reflected a depth of preparation he had not encountered before. Rather than asking what he had done, they asked how processes functioned around him. Rather than focusing on single decisions, they examined outcomes over time. Crow answered carefully, drawing on years of experience navigating inquiries, but he felt the ground shift as familiar explanations failed to resolve broader correlations. The interview concluded without conclusion, a silence that felt heavier than accusation. When Crow returned to his desk, he found access restrictions expanded, communications monitored, and authority suspended pending review. None of it was framed as punishment. It was presented as procedure. That neutrality stripped him of the narrative he relied on, the belief that his role defined his standing. Naomi followed developments from a distance, aware that the reveal was not a single moment, but a transition, the point at which hidden structures became acknowledged realities. Departments previously uninvolved requested briefings. Oversight bodies initiated independent verification. The ring that had shielded Crow was no longer invisible, its existence now documented and undeniable. Naomi reflected on how often systems protected individuals not through conspiracy, but through habit, the repetition of choices that favored convenience over accountability. The warrant disrupted that habit by forcing continuity, ensuring that no action could be viewed in isolation again. Crow, confronting the absence of support he once assumed, began to recognize the fragility of the protections he trusted. Without overt confrontation, his authority diminished, replaced by process and scrutiny. The reveal was complete not because someone declared it, but because it could no longer be ignored. Naomi understood this stage as the most critical, when truth transitioned from possibility to record. As the system adjusted to what it now acknowledged, the path forward became inevitable, guided not by outrage or spectacle, but by documentation that spoke with its own quiet authority. The consequences that followed did not resemble the dramatic reckoning many expected, but they were far more definitive. Administrative actions unfolded with precision, each step documented, reviewed, and executed according to procedure. Officer Daniel Crow was formally placed on administrative leave, a status described as temporary yet comprehensive, removing him from active duty without accusation or spectacle. His badge access was deactivated, his credentials archived pending outcome, and his role reassigned without ceremony. The language used was restrained, almost courteous, but its finality left little room for interpretation. Crow returned home earlier than usual that day, the absence of routine weighing heavier than confrontation ever could. The uniform that once defined his presence now hung and used, its authority reduced to fabric. He reviewed the notices sent to him, each one clear, methodical, and impossible to argue with. There was no single charge to contest, no dramatic moment to deflect. Instead, there was process, and process did not negotiate. Naomi Carter observed the developments from a distance, receiving confirmation that oversight committees had accepted the findings without objection. The encrypted warrant had done exactly what it was designed to do, remove discretion from accountability. Decisions were no longer filtered through relationships or familiarity. They followed protocol. Naomi understood this phase as the quiet center of justice, where outcomes were determined not by reaction, but by alignment with established standards that had too often been ignored. Across multiple departments, Individuals connected to the protective network identified by the analysis were reassigned, audited, or required to provide explanations for decisions long considered routine. No names were announced publicly. No accusations were broadcast. Yet within the system, reputations shifted as reliability replaced loyalty as the primary measure of trust. Crow felt this shift acutely as communication channels narrowed. Calls went unanswered. Messages were acknowledged without warmth. He realized that the protection he once assumed was not loyalty at all, but convenience, a structure that favored predictability until predictability became liability. As days passed, the scope of the investigation expanded beyond any single role. Policies were revised. Oversight mechanisms strengthened. The system began correcting itself in ways that could not be undone quietly. Naomi reflected on how often justice failed because it demanded attention rather than structure. The warrant had succeeded because it required neither confrontation nor persuasion. It relied on evidence and patience. Crow attended a follow-up meeting conducted entirely through formal correspondence, the questions now written, the responses required in detail. Each answer he provided was measured against records that no longer stood alone. The effect was cumulative, not accusatory, and that accumulation proved decisive. Crow began to understand that his actions were no longer judged individually, but as part of a sequence that told a larger story. That story did not require emotion to be convincing. It required consistency. Naomi remained absent from the process, her role complete. She knew that the most effective accountability often felt anticlimactic because it replaced personal conflict with institutional correction. There was no satisfaction in watching consequences unfold, only confirmation that preparation mattered. As internal reviews concluded, recommendations were issued, not as punishment, but as prevention. The ring that once shielded Crow dissolved not through exposure alone, but through irrelevance. It could no longer function in a system that had learned to observe itself. Crow, facing the reality of that change, confronted an unfamiliar truth that authority without accountability was never permanent, only tolerated. The karma he experienced did not arrive as retribution, but as removal, a quiet recalibration that stripped away the illusion of immunity. Naomi recognized this outcome as the most enduring form of justice, one that altered behavior rather than satisfying anger, ensuring that what had been exposed could not simply return under a different name. The days that followed settled into a new normal, one shaped not by headlines or public declarations, but by subtle shifts in how decisions were made and remembered. Naomi Carter moved forward without ceremony, returning to work that rarely carried visible markers of success. For her, completion did not require recognition. It required closure, the assurance that systems once resistant to reflection had been compelled to confront themselves. She understood that the absence of drama did not diminish the outcome. It strengthened it. Accountability that endured did so quietly, embedded in revised procedures and reinforced oversight rather than fleeting outrage. Officer Daniel Crow experienced this new normal from the other side of certainty. His administrative status remained unresolved, suspended in a process that no longer offered the comfort of familiarity. Days blended together as correspondence replaced conversation and review replaced routine. Without the authority he once carried effortlessly, Crow confronted an unfamiliar silence, one that offered no validation and no reassurance. The system did not argue with him. It did not accuse him. It simply moved forward without his influence. Crow began to recognize that what he had interpreted as respect had often been compliance, and that compliance faded quickly when its incentives disappeared. Within the institution, changes continued to take shape. Oversight protocols once treated as formalities became active checkpoints. Decisions required documentation rather than assumption. Patterns flagged by the warrant informed training and reform, not as punishment, but as correction. Naomi observed these developments through measured updates, each one confirming that the exposure had not been absorbed and forgotten, but integrated. The system was learning, slowly and imperfectly, but visibly. She reflected on how often justice was imagined as a moment rather than a process, how rarely it was understood as something sustained through discipline rather than emotion. Crow, navigating life without the structure that had defined him, reconsidered the choices he once dismissed as routine. Each approval he had granted without reflection now appeared in memory with sharper clarity. He recognized that the protection he enjoyed had not been earned through merit alone, but maintained through a network that valued silence over scrutiny. The removal of that network did not feel like betrayal. It felt like exposure to a standard he had never needed to meet before. Naomi remained intentionally distant from the outcome, knowing that proximity could distort perspective. Her role had never been to judge individuals, but to create conditions where judgment could no longer be avoided. In that sense, the work was complete. The warrant that had traveled silently through encrypted channels now rested archived, its purpose fulfilled. It had not condemned anyone directly. It had compelled the truth to assemble itself. As weeks passed, the institution continued its recalibration. The protective ring that once shielded Crow rendered ineffective by transparency rather than confrontation. Naomi considered this the truest measure of success, a change that persisted because it no longer relied on any one person's vigilance. Crow, facing the consequences of that change, came to understand that authority unexamined was always temporary, sustained only by the absence of challenge. The system had not turned against him. It had simply stopped accommodating him. In the quiet that followed, Naomi found no satisfaction. Only confirmation of a belief shaped by experience, that dignity endured even when recognition did not, and that justice, when allowed to operate without interference, rarely announced itself. It echoed, instead, through altered behavior, through records that could no longer be ignored, and through the knowledge that power, once exposed to truth, could never again pretend to be invisible.